Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming. In a matter of hours, Season 2 of Diablo 4. Will this make or break the game? It's no secret that Diablo 4's launch was a short-lived success. Season 2 is clearly their big effort to fix things, adding new content which is important, but also rebalancing the way the game works in a lot of ways. On that note then, we have a classic question to answer. What looks to be the best class to play in Season 2? Meaning, what would your average player likely enjoy the most? Most people seem to play around level 60 to 70, and then as the game falls off, so do they. There is a change on that front in terms of XP though. Apparently the people who hit level 70-ish will reach towards level 100 with the same amount of XP, which sounds too good to be true. It might mean though a lot more people are going to reach level 100 this season. Another major detail is that we have higher eye level gear in game now, which is rewarded more consistently from higher level enemies, so it gives us more reason to do the higher tiers of dungeons. So with all that in mind, how do we qualify what makes a class good or bad in Season 2? I think there's three realistic categories for an average player: the leveling experience, so roughly level 1 to 60, the pace at which it clears content in the mid to late game, so your early nightmare dungeons, everything in the open world, and then lastly, true endgame, like higher tier nightmare dungeon pushing, and potentially our new Season 2 boss options. We'll compare the overview of these three against the other classes and see what comes out on top, but remember, this is based on class performance in Season 1 and the patch notes in Season 2, so it's a lot of logical theory, it's not 100%. Ultimately, all of the classes in the game work and can be enjoyed start to finish. You should play what you want. But for this list, let's start from the bottom. It's once again at number 5 for me, the Barbarian, which is a real shame. The class desperately needs a facelift with new mechanics or an update to the way their shouts work at least. We really expected that. They've been talking about it. Ultimately, the Barbarian has a very limited set of options for content, with the classic standard Whirlwind being a top tier pick from day one of the game to now. Whatever build you choose to run, you should expect most of your bars to be filled up with your 3 shouts, which are so good you can't not run them. I have talked about in the past how I thought maybe they'd slam all of them into 1 or 2 buttons, making them weaker so that there's more room for other buttons on the bar, but if you take away the shouts, you kind of ruin the power of Barbarian, so it's a problem. Now, outside of that core issue with the class, you also get the worst leveling experience out of every class. Enjoy. The class is very gear reliant, right? Which makes it a chore to equip compared to other classes, and that's going to be felt very heavily during leveling when you're starved for the basics that you need to make the class run, and then by the time you have it, the initial leveling is kind of done. When it comes to the pace of play, you're actually really nice if you're running specifically Whirlwind again. You're shouting and sprinting and spinning, clearing packs of mobs with no issue, with pretty decent mobility when you're sprinting. On the other hand, your single target will suffer if you commit to that playstyle. So if you commit to, say, single target, going, say, more bleed based, well then that's great for boss killing, but now your speed and general mob clear really suffers. It's like you're all in on one aspect of the game, losing out on the other as a Barbarian. If they want us to have 2 core concepts of the game, single target with boss fights, multi-target with mob clearing nightmare dungeons, why do we still not have improved respecking or some sort of loadout system? That's my consistent question. If you did have like loadouts you could swap between smoothly, Barbarians would have a much easier time because they could have a focus build for whatever situation they're about to get into. Anyway, all of that said, a Barbarian, once it gets going and geared right, focused on a type of content with a build for it, it crushes. So they are very good, it's just a bit awkward for a variety of reasons. Maybe the new vampire powers will be massive for Barbarians, but we have to wait and see. Moving on to number 4, one I'm actually very unsure about is Sorcerers. Basically, it comes down to their true endgame experience, which has had a lot of issues in pre-season and obviously Season 1. They received a massive wall of improvements and changes during Season 1, and in Season 2, they're going to benefit largely from the new resistance system, so that'll be good too. How will they benefit from the new vampire powers though? Will their survivability finally be truly good? How will their picks for the endgame builds actually turn out? Blizzard, Firewall, and Ice Shards are probably going to be good again, but will Chain Lightning push itself into similar levels to provide more options? Maybe even Arc Glash with the new survivability can compete. So their endgame is very uncertain, but I think it's fair that Sorcerers are looking for more variety and options in proper picks in the endgame. On the other hand, they are incredible for both pace and leveling. Just look at leveling. They're flying around, teleporting, shielding against the minor damage incoming, and cleaning up mob groups super well. Speaking of the Chain Lightning builds and hopes for that in the endgame, that's going to remain an awesome pick for leveling, and one Josh has been been talking to me about recently. Firewall being more of a meta pick endgame is also very good for leveling, so you could just focus on Firewall the whole way, leveling, mid-game, endgame, and that'd be smooth. In terms of pace in the mid-game, it'll be much the same. The incoming damage still won't be enough of a threat, especially in Season 2, so you can continue to blast the open world content and low-level nightmare dungeons easily post-leveling. None of that should be a surprise. They were the most popular class for most of the game's life, from what they've told us so far, and I think Season 2 will make that even more the case, since their endgame should be improved by a big amount, which was direly needed. The question is, how will it all really turn out? We won't know until we try it. Next up, at number 3, I think it's going to be Druid. In short, Druids have fantastic potential in the mid and late game, while remaining ultra annoying in the early game. We're still going to need to farm out the vital aspects and even uniques that actually create functioning builds for Druids more than any other class. But with target farming, long-term issues like that should be relieved somewhat. We don't know the exact details of how target farming items and such is going to work, so it's hard to say, but it's the same issues as before. Druids just don't have a build that works for leveling in a smooth and satisfying way, unless Blizzard gives us aspects through the season journey that makes a difference, like a little bit that we saw in Season 1 with Pulverize. But yeah, very comparable to Barbarians and their issues during early leveling. On the brighter side, once you're through the early slog as a Druid and you've got to build somewhat, you begin blasting. Depending on the build, you're either going to be super fast, just constantly, say with Tornado Wolf, or very survivable, allowing for early pushes of content. It allows for fast, consistent clear of mob packs, which leads to a great pace in the open world content, especially early nightmare dungeons. In Season 2, there's more options for CDR, which should help for Druid's flow constantly, and while still dependent on gear and right aspects, Druid does have a brilliant pace once it has its build. But obviously there's endgame to consider where Druid is absolutely fantastic. You've got Pulverize as the classic top tier option, Bursty as hell while just made of rock, very survivable. There's the higher potential for Stormclaw, which is another unique dependent build. It needs that great Staff of the Crown, but when you've got that, you've got an ultra tanky melee build again, nearly unkillable in mid-tier content, and brilliant as an option for pushing high-tier nightmare dungeons. So while Druid struggles heavily early on, it does very well in the mid-game and dominates in the late game. And with the new target farming and better opportunities to get what you need, maybe Druid's long-term experience will be better in Season 2. At the number 2 spot though, it is my main class, the Necromancer. Despite the fact that the king build of Season 1 Bone Spear has been nerfed into absolute oblivion, Necromancer looks to be a top contender for Season 2. It has one of the strongest builds for early game leveling, if not the best, and potentially the strongest endgame build over other builds in terms of the Shadow Infinite Mist build. But despite that, it still has next to no mobility. It is the slowest class, so even when we win, it comes at a cost. Everyone else is flying around while we have to walk slowly to everything. Let's start with the leveling. This is going to be really good. Bone Spear might be gone, but who cares? Because now we have things like Overpower being changed and improved in many ways, which is awesome for blood builds. And it's the fact that the Blood Surge leveling build requires next to nothing to get going. It was actually awesome in Season 1, and it's only going to be significantly better in Season 2. You've got built-in overpower procs for the Surge itself, the key passive every 12 seconds, and the key passive has been massively buffed. You can actually improve the 12-second wait for the guaranteed overpower by picking up blood orbs that heal enough. We have new ways to spawn blood orbs via our blood skills directly. Blood Surge is just naturally tanky, super high in healing, and should have incredible output next to instantly because it's so unreliant on aspects and gear. Bloodlance, on the other hand, has very good potential with Gore Quills, that aspect that was new in Season 1, popping all of the blood orbs at once from range, which is even more efficient than Blood Surge. It's just a bit more gear dependent. So lots of potential there if that works out in, say, mid-game. Now, in terms of pace for the class, we will do well with our output in open world content and lower nightmare dungeons, that's for sure. But ultimately, you're gonna be slow as hell. The movement speed for this class is a massive pain point and will be annoying once more. If you're playing in a party while leveling, it won't matter, it'll be dead by the time you get there. However, in those events where we're standing and waiting for the mobs to come to us, we're just gonna be the best. But the mobility absolutely sucks. It's the slowest of all 5 classes. That keeps it from being number 1 on this list for me. But now talking about the end game, it's gonna be incredible. When we do get the gear we need for the different builds, I think there's 3 main builds to consider. Blood builds will likely transition to Bloodlance, like I just mentioned, while minion builds have a lot of nice improvements. The minions are going to be tankier flat out, some of our skills in the skill tree have been cleaned up a bit, the Paragon is insane, so many improvements to minion numbers, like many nodes that buffed up one specific minion type, now buff all of them. Half minion builds are going to be better than ever with the way that Shadow and Blood has higher potential. Full minion builds, we're going to have to test and see how they do compared to the other meta picks, but I've definitely felt more hope now than ever before. But the big one is obviously the Shadow builds, whether that's the true pick, which is Shadow Mist, Infamist. Obviously there's still the Sever or Corpse Explosion builds, which are going to be great there too. And then there's the new unique, the Ring, that provides overtime effects to potentially start AoEing, erupting in AoE damage like a mini Barber. Shadow damage over time is greatly improved in its potential in many ways, like the Paragon and the Scourge glyph that's now dependent on Int compared to Wisdom, so its scale is a lot higher. Obviously the fact that Blood Mist constantly has no cooldown in the Infamous build means we have high survivability in all content. So endgame Necromancer is definitely going to dominate in Season 2. It's just we're going to have to walk everywhere while everyone sprints and teleports around as usual. But finally, that brings us to the last class on the list, and number 1, I obviously think again, it's Rogue. Yeah, I rated Rogues as the best class in Season 1 due to how incredibly balanced they were. Ultra fast just inherently, and the builds were simply top tier across the board. Every build had these variations of Twisting Blades that were great, the Penetrating Shot builds, the awesome Barrage builds, the duo core build of Rapid Flurry, which mechanically was so satisfying, was also a great pick. All of them were top tier picks. Meta competitive options with lots of variety, all feeling fun. Truly, the Rogues just had the best balance. Let's then think about Rogue leveling. You hit level 15 and get all your specs, like combo points or inner sight, and suddenly you're on this huge power spike. Very early on, you get your Shadow Step and Dash for all the mobility any class could ask for, which only gets better with time and CDR. Rogue, compared to, say, Necromancer's insane potential with Blood Surge in leveling, or Sorcerer's awesome ability in mob clear, they're going to be competitive rather than a clear winner, but it's undeniable that Rogue is the fastest mover early, and continues with that into the mid-game and its wonderful mobility in mob clear, but also single target, where, you know, it doesn't really struggle with any aspect of the game before true late game, while the incoming damage just isn't a threat. And that's where we can finally poke at the Rogue in some way, its raw survivability. To avoid damage, they just have to literally avoid it, meaning it's a higher skill class in terms of avoiding and reducing incoming damage. It doesn't have the same level of damage reduction or general survivability as other classes, probably the worst out of all 5 in fact. It makes up for it with damage avoidance instead, but that means you can be like popped and one-shot when pushing endgame. Speaking of endgame and true endgame, I think back to the insane tier 100 clears and Uber Lilith clears all with Twisting Blades. It just worked super well with Barber as a heart. Obviously Barber was great for everyone, but it was that timing with the stabbing of multiple Twisting Blades and dashing out working just right with when the Barber builds up and then pops. It was very satisfying. Twisting Blades imbuement with Barber was actually competitive with the king that was Bone Spear Necromancer. And now Bone Spear is massively nerfed, but Twisting Blades, it's still good to go. So how will Rogue fare with the vampire powers compared to everyone else? That might end up deciding, say, tier lists and meta for classes into the season, but we won't know until we really get to test, like I've been saying. Overall, Rogue is great at everything except raw tankiness, which they still have an answer for with damage avoidance. But with that said, we're at the end of the video now. Overall, I think Barbarians need serious improvements to the core of the class. I think Necromancers desperately deserve some inbuilt mobility. Druids could do a bit better with early game experience, that's for sure, but maybe the target farming will help. Sorcerers will need to see how effective resistance working truly is, and maybe more viable endgame builds. But I think Rogue, across the board, has the least things we can poke at, and so I keep it at number 1. But again, keep in mind that all the classes will work great. You'll do good with any of them. This is all just a theoretical comparison before we actually get to play Season 2. Tomorrow it drops though, so until then, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.